Hi, I'm Kimberly Washburn, Curator of Education at the Florence County Museum. Welcome to Family Day at Home. Today we're going to be creating a watercolor painting using a wax resist technique in the style of South Carolina artist Dr. Leo Twiggs. Dr. Twiggs is an African-American artist from St. Stephen, South Carolina. He's most well known for his use of a process called Batik. Batik is an African textile process that uses a wax resist in combination with dyes to create patterns and designs. We're going to create a watercolor painting using a wax resist today that will create similar effects to the batiks that are created by Dr. Leo Twiggs. Let's get started on our watercolor resist painting. Dr. Leo Twiggs uses a process called Batik to create his artworks. In a batik, an artist uses a wax resist. They'll put hot wax down on fabric, and that wax will resist any dye or paint from soaking into the area where the wax is applied. We're going to use a similar process with paper to create a resist painting. You'll want to grab your Family Day at Home kit and pull out the following supplies. You're going to need your sheet of white paper. You're going to need your white crayon, your watercolor palette, and your disposable brush. You're also going to need to gather a few things from around the house. You're going to need a cup of water. You might need a pencil with an eraser. If you don't have a pencil, a pen can work, or you can just go straight to the crayon. And you'll need some paper towel. If you would prefer to use a regular paintbrush and you have one at home, feel free to use it, but our little disposable one will work just fine for this project as well. You're going to begin by creating a line drawing. Now you can draw directly onto your paper using a pencil, and I have done that with another one back here, like this. Now I've just created a little landscape drawing with lines. What's important about your drawing, it doesn't matter if it's a landscape or maybe a portrait or anything that you're interested in drawing. What matters is that your lines are simple, there's not a lot of detail, and that your lines enclose space. What I mean by that is that either your lines should go from one end of the paper all the way to the other end, or they should be a closed shape, like a square or a circle or a triangle, or any shape at all. This is important because in the batik process, the wax keeps the dye or the paint from flowing into other areas of the artwork. And so we're going to try to use that same principle here. We want to make sure that we have closed shapes that will keep our paint where we want it. Now, I could take my crayon and draw right over the lines that I've created. The problem with that is that you will still see those lines underneath our white crayon. Let me show you what I mean. If I were to take my crayon and just draw right on these lines, those lines are still going to show up in my finished work. They're not hidden, and I can't really erase them once I've drawn over it with that wax. So, it's not a great idea to go right on top of your lines. I recommend either drawing on a scrap sheet of paper or drawing on the back of your paper. If I flip my paper over, I can still see, I don't know if you guys can see, but I can still see traces of those lines, and I could trace over it with my wax crayon, or I could lay my sheet of paper, if I used a scrap sheet of paper, I could lay my sheet of paper right over the top and trace over those lines. Now, I've already copied most of my lines onto this paper using the crayon. Now, crayons are made primarily of wax, and so that's what our wax resist, very similar to the batik process, is going to be. This is going to lay down an area where the paint won't soak into the paper. So what I'm going to do is go ahead and trace the rest of my lines right on to the paper, and I'm pressing down firmly. Now I don't want to press down so hard that I break my crayon, but I do want a nice solid line. It can be tricky to see white crayon on white paper, so if you're not sure if you've made your lines thick enough, you can go over it again. Sometimes you can even feel with your finger, and you can feel where you put that wax crayon line down. And I've just got one more line to draw here. Pressing nice and firmly. Now, if you couldn't find a pencil or a pen, you could just go straight to drawing with your crayon. You might be surprised by what you get at the end because it's tricky to see the lines, so that could be fun. Now that I have my drawing on my paper, and I've completely drawn it with my wax crayon, you probably can't see it. You might be able to see a little bit of shine to the white. If I turn it this way, I can see where those lines are. The light doesn't really reflect easily off the wax. But I'm ready to paint. Now, the type of paint that we're going to be using is watercolor. Now, your watercolor palette that you've been given is dry watercolor paint on a slick surface. And so all you have to do is reconstitute that with water. So what we're going to do is this. You can use a brush like this one if you have one at home, or you can use just your little disposable brush that we've given you, and you're just going to dip it into some water, and you're going to decide what color that you want to use. So I'm going to try to use warm colors for my background to create sort of a sunset, and I'm going to use cool colors for my foreground to create sort of the grassy landscape. So I'm getting my brush nice and wet, and I want to start in the background. So I'm going to start with some yellow, and I've got my wet brush, and I'm just going to gently get that yellow area wet. I don't need a ton of water, but I don't want to rub it too hard. I really just want to let the water soak into the paint, and you'll see that it's picking up on my brush. And I'm just going to go ahead and paint in this area. And you'll notice that, let me get a little more water here, that if I paint right over the top of that line I created with my crayon, you see that? The paint doesn't stick to the area where my crayon made a line. Now you can wash your brush off. These little disposable brushes, you might see a little stain on there, and that's fine. It's not really going to mix into your colors. You can wash it. Your paper towel is for drying your brush if you want to do that. When you're switching colors, you do need a fair amount of water though. So I'm going to switch to my orange. I'm making a sunset, so I kind of want to gradually get a little darker and a little darker. And so I'm going to bring that paint in here. I like to go a little over the top of my line so I can see that resist effect. If you need a little more water, just go back to your water cup. And I'm just painting in using my watercolor paint. And I might even add a little more water. You get some little chunks of paint, you can just wipe those off on your paper towel. Now you can make the watercolor darker by using less water, darker by using less water, or lighter by using more water. In fact, if you want to lighten up a color, you might just want to use just plain water and use that to lighten things up a little. I'm going to wash my brush off again, give it a little dab, make sure it's clean. I might want to add a little more yellow in there just to blend that together a little better. Okay. And I'm going to continue to do this to create a sunset effect here on my painting. Now, batik is originally an African textile process. It's a traditional African textile process. And the batik artist would use hot wax, and they would use a special tool to apply that wax to the fabric. And they would just draw right onto the fabric with that tool. And then dip the entire thing, their entire fabric piece, into a dye. Now, Dr. Twiggs uses the process a little bit differently. Dr. Twiggs applies his wax to his fabric, and then he paints on the dyes to create a little bit more of an intentional, controlled effect. So you can see in my painting that I'm just gently adding the watercolor in to my design, blending colors as I go. Okay, I'm just adding a few finishing touches to my watercolor painting, just a little bit of blending. I've used warm colors in the background and cool colors in the foreground to create a landscape painting using that watercolor resist semi-batik technique, something similar to the style of Dr. Leo Twiggs. I hope you've enjoyed learning a little bit about how wax resists watercolor paint. Think a little bit about what other types of paintings you could use with this process. Maybe you would like to make a portrait or draw something from nature that you find and use this wax and paint resist technique in your artwork in the future.